November 15, 1942, 0100 hours, 8,400 yards south of Savo Island. The Imperial Japanese battleship Kirishima slipped through the black of night, her silhouette barely more than a shadow against the sea. On the bridge, Captain Sanji Iwabuchi trusted what he had every reason to trust: exquisitely crafted optical instruments, the disciplined eyes of a crew schooled in nocturnal seamanship, and years of painstaking training that had forged a navy confident in its mastery of night fighting. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had placed supreme faith in vision, human sight amplified by the finest rangefinders and binoculars money could buy. Those instruments had decided countless engagements in the Pacific's early months and given Japanese gunners a decisive edge when the stars were the only light. Captain Iwabuchi, peering through those rangefinders, believed he had the advantage that darkness could grant. He did not know, however, that almost a mile away, 8,400 yards, an American battleship had been tracking his every move for 7 uninterrupted minutes. The Americans were not watching through glass. No searchlights carved the night. No human lookout strained his neck and squinted at the horizon. Instead, they had harnessed something invisible. Radio waves bounced back from targets, electronic eyes that pierced smoke and rain and midnight like daylight, transforming silence into precise information. Range, bearing, and velocity in real time. At 0100 hours, the USS Washington opened fire. 96-inch projectiles roared across the dark and found their mark with terrifying efficiency. Accounts vary. Japanese damage control sketches and later examinations of the wreck suggest as many as 20 hits, but at least 9 heavy shells slammed into Kirishima within minutes. The effects were catastrophic. Steering jammed, the main battery fell mute, progressive flooding threatened to capsize the ship, and raging fires consumed her superstructure. By 0325 hours, she rolled and sank, taking 212 men with her, while 1,098 survivors were recovered. Captain Iwabuchi survived and later sent a report to Admiral Nutake Kondo asserting that his gunners had struck the American vessel, a belief he held sincerely, even as the truth of the night told a different story. In the chaotic immediacy of close fighting, with the world reduced to flashes of flame, the shriek of metal and the gutting thunder of shells, it was not possible for Iwabuchi to see what invisible technology could do. He watched his salvos fall short or fly wide. He saw nothing of the ship that had appeared, fired, and vanished. And so he concluded, honestly, that he had exchanged hits with a visible foe. But the record shows otherwise. The Washington, under Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr., emerged unscathed. Not a single Japanese shell found its mark on her. This was no accident. It was the practical demonstration of a new kind of naval dominance, radar-directed gunfire against an enemy that could not comprehend, much less respond to, the presence firing upon them. The Washington's Mark 8 radar held Kirishima in its sights for the whole engagement, beaming range and bearing into mechanical computing equipment. Mark 1A calculators that translated electronic input into gun orders with a speed and precision no human team could match. The result was a lethal choreography of shells and impact executed from beyond visual range. The battle was decided by sightless instruments and disciplined industrial processes rather than by who had the sharper human eyes on deck. This encounter at Guadalcanal exposed something fundamental. The rules of naval warfare had shifted. The Japanese Navy, rightly proud of a culture that traced its competitive edge back to the Russo-Japanese War, had invested decades in rigorous training, optical excellence, and tactical innovation. Their lookouts could pick out ship silhouettes at distances most American crews could not. Their gunners could bring effective, rapid fire to bear after target acquisition. Their torpedo forces had produced the Type 93 Long Lance, a weapon capable of reaching 44,000 yards at 38 knots, propelled by oxygen so it left little or no wake, and packed a 490-kilogram warhead, more than double the explosive mass of contemporary American torpedoes. That doctrine, take existing technologies, perfect them, and teach crews to exploit tiny advantages, brought victories in engagements such as Savo Island, where Japanese cruisers devastated Allied forces in night combat. But the Americans were doing something different. Rather than merely perfecting the visible tools of combat, they were fundamentally altering the fabric of naval warfare itself. Their revolution began in laboratories, in curiosity-driven physics at the Naval Research Laboratory during the 1930s, where researchers discovered that ships produced detectable reflections when struck by radio waves. That simple observation, pursued with a systematic appetite for turning theory into practice, matured into radar, an instrument that could find and follow ships regardless of visibility. By 1940, the USS New York had demonstrated that it was possible to direct gunfire using radar data. The early systems were crude, cloaked in complexity and requiring many operators and manual calculations. Yet, they proved a principle. Guns could be aimed and fired at targets the crew could not see. Admiral Ernest King, who would soon command the U.S. fleet, understood the implication immediately. He pushed for vast, rapid development, not just to add radar as a supplemental sensor, but to integrate electronic detection into every naval domain. Detection, tracking, fire control, navigation, aircraft direction. Anything that traditionally relied on human eyes could be enhanced or replaced by electronic systems, and with that replacement came a different kind of combat advantage. The engineering and organizational challenge was staggering. Early radar was experimental. Turning it into reliable shipboard systems demanded solutions in miniaturization, robustness against vibration and salt air, and precision far beyond many pre-war factory tolerances. The U.S. response was not a single stroke of genius, but an almost industrial application of collective effort. In October 1940, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology established the Radiation Laboratory. Within a year, some 4,000 scientists and engineers were working on radar problems there. Over the war, the Rad Lab produced more than 100 distinct radar systems, each tuned to specific tactical tasks. What made this effort unusual was how Darwinian it was in practice. Many teams worked in parallel, competition was encouraged, and successful designs and lessons were shared instantly. Failures were dissected and their lessons broadcast. Engineers worked hand in glove with manufacturers, ensuring prototypes were not only effective, but producible at scale. Component standardization simplified logistics and sped retrofit programs. The lab's output was matched to fleet feedback. When reports revealed shortcomings, design teams iterated quickly. Weeks or months, not years. The Americans fielded systems like the Mark V for aircraft tracking, the Mark VIII for surface fire control, Mark XII for improved surface tracking, and Mark 22 for close-range anti-aircraft direction. Each system filled a tactical niche identified by sailors in combat, and the whole ecosystem matured under a pressure to deliver, mass produce, and integrate. When an issue arose with one radar, another group adapted a fix that was then shared across theaters. Japan, by contrast, had scientific genius, but lacked the industrial muscle and organizational model to translate laboratory breakthroughs into thousands of deployed units. Japanese radar research remained fragmented and often academic into 1943. Brilliant work in component physics, and even the development of a 10-centimeter cavity magnetron as early as 1939 did not translate into fleet-wide deployments. Japanese engineers and admirals tended to demand perfection before fielding new systems, a cultural tendency that led to delayed rollouts. By the time workable Japanese radars reached the fleet in numbers, American designs had already advanced through multiple generations, and the technological gap widened. The Mark 8 fire control radar, introduced in mid-1942, could track surface targets at up to 25,000 yards in complete darkness, delivering range, bearing, and rate of change data sufficiently precise to aim main batteries. Early American units were imperfect. Interference, false returns, and teething problems persisted. Yet U.S. naval doctrine accepted practical imperfection when it conferred a tactical edge, preferring rapid deployment and iterative improvement. Japan, conditioned by a perfectionist engineering culture and constrained by limited industrial capacity stretched across ships, aircraft, and weapons production, could not match that pace of mass adaptation. By mid-1943, American surface combatants were habitually outfitted with multiple radar sets specialized for different tasks: long-range detection via SG surface search radar, dedicated fire control sets for gun direction, and air search arrays that detected aircraft at ranges allowing effective fighter direction. Information flowed into plotting rooms where operators synthesized the electronic picture into actionable battlefield awareness. Japanese ships, if they had radar at all, typically carried a single set primarily used for warning. Fire control remained an optical art. The clash at Savo Island and the sinking of Kirishima were not isolated oddities, but symptoms of a broader strategic transition. The Americans had not merely tacked a new sensor onto existing tactics. They had reimagined how to sense, decide, and shoot. Industrial organization, a culture of rapid prototyping, and the willingness to field good enough systems en masse let the United States convert laboratory discoveries into naval dominance. The Imperial Japanese Navy, despite tactical brilliance and weapons like the Long Lance, had been outpaced by an opponent that learned how to leverage invisible machines to make the night transparent. On that November night in 1942, at 8,400 yards and in the absence of visible contact, radar erased the traditional advantages that had made Japanese night fighting so feared. The Washington's unseen eyes and mechanized brains rewrote the score. When the sea settled and the survivors were counted, it became clear that a new era had arrived. One where the side that mastered electronics and organized its industrial might around rapid iteration would seize a decisive edge. The Kirishima's loss was a single, stark demonstration of that change. A ship designed for a world where sight-decided battles had been undone by a technology that let men fight without ever needing to see their enemy. By late 1942, the technological gap between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the U.S. Navy had become not just apparent, but fatal. In the dark waters off Guadalcanal, Japanese warships still trusted in the eyes of their lookouts, while the Americans relied on instruments that could see through the night itself. During the Battle of Guadalcanal, this contrast revealed itself with chilling clarity. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, Jr., commanding Task Force 64, led two modern American battleships, USS Washington and USS South Dakota, supported by 4 destroyers. His mission: intercept and stop the Japanese fleet, attempting to reinforce their troops on the island. Intelligence had warned that a powerful Japanese group was inbound, led by the battleship Kirishima and a screen of cruisers and destroyers under Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo. Lee, however, was no ordinary commander. Before the war, he had proven himself a marksman of extraordinary precision, winning 5 gold medals for shooting at the 1920 Olympic Games in Antwerp. That same mathematical precision and calm focus defined how he fought. Even more crucially, Lee had been involved in radar development and testing since its infancy. He didn't just know how to use radar, he understood it. He had studied its quirks, its errors, its capabilities, and its promise. In 1942, when most commanders viewed radar as an experimental novelty, Lee treated it as a trusted weapon. He had conducted drills using radar to direct gunfire, personally witnessing how accurate it could be, even when the target was completely invisible. This gave Lee something almost no other commander possessed at the time: confidence. Confidence that the glowing blips on a cathode ray screen told the truth, even when his eyes saw nothing. He was willing to fight based solely on electronic data, without waiting for visual confirmation, a decision that would rewrite naval warfare. At 23:17 on November 14, 1942, the Washington's SG radar picked up contacts over 18,000 yards away. Japanese ships, the Kirishima and her escorts, were closing in, unaware they had already been spotted and targeted. Lee held fire, allowing the enemy to approach, while his radar-guided fire control system quietly tracked every movement and computed firing solutions automatically. His crew waited in tense silence. They could hear the rumble of enemy engines through the sound detection gear. Lookouts strained for any glimpse through the darkness and rain. But Lee gave no order to open fire. He trusted his instruments completely. The Japanese, depending entirely on visual detection, remained oblivious. As Kondo's formation split, attempting to flank and catch the Americans by surprise, a textbook maneuver against an opponent limited by sight, Lee's plotting teams already had their entire disposition mapped with perfect accuracy. Then, at 0100 hours, with Kirishima just 8,400 yards away, Lee gave the order. The Washington's 16-inch guns thundered in the dark, firing purely on radar solutions. The first salvo hit home. A massive explosion erupted aboard Kirishima, the flames lighting up the Black Sea. The first visual confirmation of her position for anyone on either side. But by then, it was far too late. Shell after shell followed, guided by radar with mechanical precision. Each salvo landed closer to the last, tearing open the Japanese battleship's hull and superstructure. Kirishima's gunners desperately tried to return fire, but their rangefinders could see nothing through the smoke and rain. Their salvos were guesses, wild shots at the flashes of Washington's guns, and none found their mark. Within 7 minutes, Kirishima was crippled. Her main guns fell silent, her steering jammed, and her list grew heavier. She would sink a few hours later. In those 7 minutes, the Washington fired 75 16-inch shells. At least 9, possibly 20, scored direct hits. Kirishima managed only a few inaccurate salvos. The difference wasn't bravery or training. Both sides had those in abundance. The difference was information. Lee fought with near-perfect data. Kondo fought blind. Admiral Kondo's later report admitted the Americans possessed detection and gunnery abilities that seemed almost supernatural. Japanese officers could not understand how the enemy fired so accurately in total darkness, without using searchlights or optical rangefinders. Many assumed the Americans had developed new types of ultra-sensitive optics. The truth, that the Americans were firing accurately using radar alone, seemed too fantastical to believe. This disbelief was not ignorance. It was experience speaking. Japanese doctrine held that radar was useful for detection, but far too imprecise for direct fire control. And with Japanese radar, that was true. Their systems lacked the accuracy and computing integration of the American Mark 8 and Mark 1A. Japanese engineers had no idea just how far the U.S. had advanced. It took months and the accumulation of many defeats for the truth to sink in. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi, an analyst on the 8th Fleet staff, was tasked with studying the growing pattern of American success. He compiled reports from multiple night engagements and began noticing a disturbing trend. American ships consistently opened fire at ranges far beyond visual detection. Their accuracy in night battles exceeded what optics could possibly achieve. They maneuvered as though they knew Japanese positions before seeing them. Omi's conclusion was daring but inescapable. The Americans had developed detection and fire control systems superior to anything Japan possessed. His 1943 report estimated that U.S. radar technology was at least 2 years ahead. Many senior officers dismissed the assessment as defeatist or exaggerated. Japan's propaganda machine had long portrayed the United States as industrially soft and technologically second-rate. The idea that the Americans were 2 years ahead in electronics seemed unthinkable. Yet Omi was right, and the gap was growing wider every month. By mid-1943, the difference had stretched to nearly 3 years. Newly commissioned U.S. destroyers carried radar systems more capable than those on Japanese battleships. American fire control radars were now directly integrated, with analog mechanical computers that automatically calculated gun aim, eliminating most human error and delay. The Mark 37 gun director epitomized this integration. It combined both optical and radar inputs, feeding data into the Mark 1A fire control computer. Operators could track targets visually when visible, or switch instantly to radar when obscured by weather or darkness. The transition was seamless. The system maintained firing accuracy even as the target disappeared from sight. The Mark 1A computer itself was a masterpiece of wartime engineering. It filled an entire room with interlocking gears, cams, and servo motors, constantly solving complex equations that predicted where a target would be by the time a shell arrived. Operators entered variables like wind speed, ship roll, and even gunpowder temperature. The machine then continuously updated gun, elevation, and bearing, automatically correcting between salvos based on radar feedback. Earlier mechanical computers required human correction based on observing shell splashes. The Mark 1A closed that loop. Radar data showing a miss automatically adjusted the next shot. The system effectively removed human reaction time from naval gunnery. The result was astonishing accuracy at distances and conditions once thought impossible. American battleships could hit moving targets 20,000 yards away in total darkness. Japanese gunners, by contrast, were often reduced to firing at the muzzle flashes of enemy guns, unable to see where their shots landed. But this superiority extended beyond any single system. It was about integration. On American ships, radar data from multiple sources flowed into centralized combat information centers, CICs. Surface search radar provided a broad view of enemy movement. Fire control radar tracked specific targets. Air search radar monitored the skies. Teams of operators combined all this information into a unified tactical picture that commanders could use instantly. Japanese ships had no such nerve center. Their radar, if installed at all, was usually a single-purpose warning set. Gunnery officers still relied on rangefinders, stopwatches, and human estimation. The difference was profound. American commanders fought with near-total situational awareness, while Japanese officers made decisions from fragmented, often outdated information. This technological imbalance shaped every major naval battle that followed. American carrier groups, guided by radar, could detect enemy air raids over 100 miles away, giving fighter directors precious minutes to scramble interceptors and position them precisely. Japanese carriers, still dependent on visual sighting, often didn't realize they were under attack until American planes were already diving toward them. By June 1944, this disparity culminated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier engagement in history. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 Japanese carriers with over 400 aircraft. His plan was to use Japan's long-range planes to strike the American fleet while staying out of range himself. The success of that plan depended on spotting the enemy first and launching before the Americans could respond. Neither condition was met. On the morning of June 19th, as Ozawa's first wave of 69 aircraft took off, American radar picked up the formation almost immediately, even while the planes were still organizing over their own carriers. Fighter directors aboard U.S. ships vectored F-6F Hellcats directly toward the incoming Japanese. The intercept was so precisely timed that Japanese pilots were ambushed before they even reached attack range. The results were devastating. Of the first wave, only 27 aircraft limped back. None scored hits. 3 more waves followed that day, all met with the same deadly choreography. Long-range radar detection, perfectly timed fighter interception, and anti-aircraft fire, guided by radar and proximity fuses. By nightfall, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft. While American losses were just 29, from Ozawa's bridge aboard the carrier Taiho, the scene defied logic. His strike groups vanished into the sky and never returned. Radio messages crackled with panic. Japanese pilots reported being attacked by fighters who seemed to know their exact position and heading long before visual contact. The explanation was simple, yet incomprehensible to him. The Americans could see the invisible. Radar had transformed the Pacific into an American battlefield, one where the enemy's eyes no longer mattered. By the summer of 1944, the psychological toll of American radar dominance had become as devastating as its physical effects. Surviving Japanese aviators spoke of an enemy who seemed able to see through cloud, darkness, and distance. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, a carrier division commander who later chronicled Japan's air war, wrote that after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, pilots no longer felt they were entering battle but flying into the gaze of an invisible observer. What they sensed was not superstition. It was a clear recognition of the new reality that radar created, an enemy who possessed near-total awareness. American fleets could track aircraft before they left formation, direct fighters to precise interception points, and coordinate defensive fire with unearthly accuracy. For Japanese air crews, every mission became an ordeal against a foe who seemed omniscient. That perception deepened when a new weapon appeared, the proximity fuse. Developed by scientists at the Applied Physics Laboratory and the National Defense Research Committee's Section T, it turned physics itself into firepower. Introduced in January 1943, the device used a miniature radar transmitter and receiver to detonate anti-aircraft shells when they passed near a target. A near miss now became a lethal burst. When the cruiser Helena first employed proximity-fused 5-inch shells against Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal on January 5, 1943, observers saw the sky erupt with explosions that shredded attacking planes. Accuracy no longer depended entirely on the gunner's eye. The shell itself sensed its victim. Reports from the fleet described immediate results. Hit probabilities doubled, sometimes tripled, and pilots began to speak of invisible hands plucking them from the air. The device was a masterpiece of engineering. Each fuse had to endure the shock of being fired, accelerations exceeding 20,000 times gravity, while keeping delicate electronic circuits intact. It had to function in rain, cold, humidity, and vibration, all within a steel shell hurled miles through the sky. Inside, tiny vacuum tubes acted as radio oscillators. A battery, activated by firing shock, provided power for the few seconds of flight. It was required to discriminate between aircraft and surface clutter, detonate only at the right distance, and remain safe until clear of the ship that fired it. Achieving that demanded miniaturization at a level few had believed possible. The American program drew on over 4,000 engineers and technicians working in strict secrecy across multiple laboratories and factories. Components were produced separately to maintain security. Final assembly took place in guarded plants, where every fuse was tested before acceptance. By 1944, production exceeded 100,000 units per month. Each was cheap enough for mass use, yet reliable enough to trust in battle. For Japanese pilots, the psychological impact was enormous. Anti-aircraft bursts now seemed preternaturally accurate, detonating close even when tracer fire looked off target. They could not understand the mechanism and thus could not devise countermeasures. Japanese scientists were aware that such fuses were theoretically possible. Research groups had explored the concept, but their industrial base lacked the precision manufacturing, miniature electronics, and quality control necessary to make them real. The proximity fuse was less a single invention than the expression of an entire technological ecosystem, a union of advanced science and mass production that Japan, strained by shortages and decentralization, could not replicate. By late 1944, the war at sea had effectively split into two separate realities. Japan continued to fight a traditional naval war, dependent on visual detection, manual gunnery, and the courage of individuals. The United States fought an information war, radar-directed, electronically coordinated, and increasingly automated. Darkness, fog, and distance that once shielded ships now favored those with the best instruments. American commanders planned operations, assuming continuous radar coverage and instantaneous communication. Night engagements, once exceptional, became routine. Japanese doctrine, still rooted in visual tactics, regarded such battles as hazardous even for elite crews. The consequences became brutally clear at the Battle of Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura led 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 4 destroyers through the narrow waters of the strait in a courageous attempt to attack American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. His ships advanced into darkness, unaware that radar screens aboard. American patrol craft were already following every move. At 02:36 hours, Nishimura's force was plotted and tracked in real time as it steamed into a trap set by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. Waiting ahead were 6 U.S. battleships, 8 cruisers, and destroyer squadrons positioned to cross the enemy's T, bringing full broadsides against a column that could reply with only forward guns. This classic tactic, once dependent on timing and visibility, was now executed with radar precision. American destroyers attacked first, launching torpedoes guided by electronic bearings. Then the battleships opened fire from 20,000 yards, their salvos directed by radar fire control that required no visual sighting. Within minutes, shells rained onto the Japanese column. Both battleships, the cruiser, and 3 destroyers were sunk. The last destroyer fled aflame. American losses were negligible. Japanese lookouts never sighted the enemy. Their first awareness came with explosions tearing through their decks. Nishimura had sailed blind into an opponent who had been watching him for hours. The battle lasted less than 30 minutes. Analysts afterward noted that tactics which once promised success had become fatal when faced with radar-guided fire. After the war, production statistics made the scale of American superiority undeniable. Between December 1941 and September 1945, U.S. shipyards launched 28 fleet carriers. Japan produced 17 of all types, many converted from other hulls. The United States built 71 escort carriers, small, inexpensive ships that spread air power across the Pacific, while Japan built none. 8 modern American battleships were completed during the war, all designed or modified to incorporate radar and electronic fire control. Japan launched no new capital ships after Yamato and Musashi. monumental vessels conceived before radar had matured. Every new American design integrated electronics from the start. The North Carolina class, begun before the war, was redesigned mid-construction to accept radar arrays. The Iowa class was conceived with electronic warfare in mind. Its internal spaces arranged for wiring, power distribution, and combat information centers. In contrast, Yamato and Musashi embodied the perfection of a vanished age. 64,000 tons of armor and artillery optimized for visual gunnery. Their optical rangefinders were exquisite, their guns the largest ever built. But their radar sets were crude additions awkwardly fitted into spaces never meant for them. They were giants, built to fight battles that no longer existed. The difference lay not merely in machinery, but in philosophy. Japanese designers sought to refine existing forms, bigger guns, thicker armor, better optics, while American engineers sought to redefine warfare itself through integration of sensors, computers, and communication. Japan aimed to win the traditional decisive battle. America aimed to render that concept obsolete. By 1944, a U.S. destroyer possessed radar and fire control capabilities that rivaled a pre-war cruiser. American submarines attacked on the surface at night using radar, while Japanese submarines still relied on periscopes and human vision. The technological hierarchy reversed. What had been a first-rate ship in 1942 was a relic by 1944. The most visible manifestation of this revolution was the Essex-class carrier. Each displaced about 27,000 tons standard, stretched nearly 900 feet, and could carry more than 100 aircraft. But its true power lay in the electronics hidden within. Every Essex carried an array of radars, long-range air search, surface search, height finding, and fire control sets. All data flowed into the Combat Information Center, a compartment bristling with screens, plotting tables, and headsets, where operators synthesized the picture of the surrounding battlespace. From these rooms, fighter directors could vector patrols to intercept incoming raids hundreds of miles away, coordinate defensive barrages, and manage offensive strikes with precision unknown before the war. 24 Essex carriers were completed, 17 of them seeing combat. They formed the backbone of the fast carrier task forces that destroyed Japanese naval aviation, supported amphibious invasions, and eventually struck Japan itself. These ships operated aggressively, often within range of Japanese land-based bombers, because radar made surprise impossible for the enemy. Combat air patrols could be launched in time. Fighters could be guided directly to attackers. The fleets that once feared ambush now sought it. By contrast, Japanese carriers late in the war could no longer operate independently. Lacking comparable radar and coordination, they had to stay within reach of land-based aircraft for protection. The strategic roles of the two navies reversed. The Imperial Navy, which had once roamed the Pacific at will, now hid under the umbrella of its home islands, while American fleets moved with impunity across oceans. Night operations, once a Japanese specialty, became routine for the U.S. Navy. American ships fought with instruments. Japanese crews still trusted eyesight and instinct. The transformation was total. Battleships hunted enemy surface forces with radar-guided guns. Japanese battleships were reduced to escorting convoys or bombarding shore positions, their enormous guns irrelevant against foes who struck from unseen distances. When peace finally came, Japanese officers looked back on the war with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who survived to become a general in the post-war Air Self-Defense Force, wrote extensively about what he called the technological eclipse. In works such as Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, co-authored with Mitsuo Fuchida, he argued that Japan's defeat was not a failure of courage, but of understanding. The Imperial Navy had fought with honor but with tools and doctrines of an earlier century. The United States had entered a new age of war, in which information and industry outweighed tradition and valor. Radar, computation, and the capacity for mass production had turned the tide long before the final shots were fired. By the end, Japanese sailors spoke almost with reverence of the unseen power that had guided American guns and planes. They realized too late that their adversary had not merely built better ships. He had built a different kind of navy, one that could see in the dark. Masatake Okumiya was not merely a participant in the Pacific War. He was a witness to the transformation of warfare itself. Graduating from the Imperial Japanese Navy Academy in 1930, he came of age in a navy at the height of its confidence and tradition. As an aviator and later a carrier division commander, Okumiya experienced firsthand the exhilaration of Japan's early victories and the despair of its later defeats. He planned operations, flew combat missions, and watched as the principles he had been trained to master were slowly rendered irrelevant by an enemy who fought with a different understanding of war. After Japan's surrender, he dedicated himself to analyzing what had gone wrong. His post-war writings, composed with the objectivity of a professional and the humility of a survivor, made him one of the most respected interpreters of Japan's naval experience for American audiences. Okumiya's central conclusion was simple yet profound. The Japanese Navy entered the war in 1941 with tactics and doctrines perfectly adapted to the technological conditions of that moment. Pilots trained to spot enemy aircraft by sight and engage in close-range combat. Gunnery officers drilled relentlessly in manual fire control and optical range-finding. Night-fighting specialists honed their senses to detect enemy silhouettes on the horizon. Every element of the Navy's structure assumed that battles would be decided by human skill under visible conditions. It was a system of excellence built for a world where man remained the primary instrument of perception and decision. The problem, as Okumiya observed, was that this world ceased to exist within months of the war's outbreak. American forces did not simply fight better, they changed the technological baseline of combat itself. Through relentless innovation and deployment, they raised the standard by which success was measured. By 1943, radar, electronic fire control, and automated computation had become decisive. Visual detection, the skill that Japanese aviators and sailors had spent years perfecting, no longer determined outcomes. American ships could find, track, and strike opponents beyond the limits of human sight. Battles were being decided before Japanese forces even realized they had begun. What had once been an arena of human mastery was now governed by the cold precision of instruments. Okumiya was adamant that Japan's defeat was not the result of cowardice or lack of discipline. Japanese sailors and pilots fought with unwavering determination to the very end. Morale remained remarkably strong, even as the war turned hopeless. In the face of shortages, bombardment, and exhaustion, units maintained cohesion and pride. But bravery could not compensate for systemic disadvantage. The courage of an individual could not alter the outcome of engagements determined by machines that could see farther, react faster, and calculate more accurately than any human being. The same conclusion was reached by another remarkable Japanese officer, Lieutenant Commander Tadao Omeya, a meticulous analyst and strategist who had foreseen the problem even before Japan's early successes faded. A graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1922, Omeya served as a staff officer in several fleet commands, giving him access to operational intelligence and planning. During the war, his analytical mind became invaluable. He studied enemy tactics, tracked technological developments, and understood, long before many of his peers, that Japan was losing not because of flawed strategy, but because it had been overtaken by a new form of warfare. After the surrender, he was interviewed extensively by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. American interrogators described him as one of the most reliable and perceptive officers they encountered. His insights helped clarify how Japanese command decisions had been shaped by incomplete information and technological blindness. Omeya's post-war writings for the United States Naval Institute proceedings provided a rare and honest Japanese perspective on the technological dimension of the war. His 1951 article, Japanese Commentary on Guadalcanal, corrected many American misconceptions about the early campaigns and emphasized that Japan's defeat had been preordained once the United States committed to systematic technological expansion. Later, as a consultant to Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison for his monumental history of U.S. naval operations, Omeya contributed detailed analyses of how technological asymmetry had shaped key battles. His verdict echoed Okumiya's. Japan's naval forces had not been beaten through lack of skill or willpower, but through a cumulative technological inferiority that grew more crippling with each passing year. Omeya estimated that in late 1941, American radar and fire control systems were roughly 2 years ahead of Japanese equivalents. By mid-1943, that margin had widened to 3 years. By the end of the war, it exceeded 5. The disparity was not static, it accelerated. American laboratories and factories operated in a self-reinforcing cycle of improvement, where each generation of equipment informed and enhanced the next. Japan, struggling under material shortages and strategic isolation, could barely field its first-generation systems before they were obsolete. Technological progress, Omeya observed, functioned like compound interest. Small advantages multiplied over time until they became overwhelming. He believed Japan's fundamental mistake lay not in neglecting research, but in misunderstanding the nature of modern industrial warfare. The Imperial Navy possessed brilliant engineers and inventive minds, but its approach to technology remained fragmented. Innovations were treated as isolated achievements rather than as components of a continuously evolving system. A device might work perfectly in the laboratory or on a single prototype, yet without mass production, standardized integration, and consistent improvement, it had no strategic value. The United States, by contrast, had mastered the art of scaling technology, turning scientific discovery into military capability through coordinated effort across research institutions, industry, and the armed forces. American victory was not the triumph of a single invention, it was the triumph of a process. For the American military, this realization became doctrine. The war had demonstrated that technological superiority could create advantages so overwhelming that traditional measures, courage, training, tactical ingenuity, were reduced to secondary factors. The officers who fought the Pacific Campaign returned home convinced that no future war could be safely fought without maintaining a decisive edge in research, development, and production. They saw technology not as a tool, but as a force multiplier, capable of reshaping the battlefield itself. From radar and analog computers came guided missiles, electronic warfare, and eventually the integrated battle networks that defined the late 20th century. The principle remained unchanged. Automate wherever possible, remove human error, and connect systems so that their combined effect exceeded what any individual component could achieve. For Japan, the contrast was tragic. The Imperial Navy of 1941 was among the most formidable maritime forces ever assembled. Its officers were superb professionals, trained through rigorous programs that emphasized discipline, seamanship, and initiative. Its enlisted men were skilled, its ships modern, its equipment meticulously maintained. Tactically and operationally, it was the equal of any navy in the world. But as Okumiya later reflected, those virtues were bound to a particular technological era. When that era ended, so too did Japan's advantages. The fast battleship, the mass torpedo attack, the exquisitely trained night-fighting crews, these were magnificent expressions of human skill, yet they belonged to a world where men fought by what they could see. In a world governed by radar and computation, such mastery became almost irrelevant. The fate of the battleship Kirishima symbolized that transformation. By the standards of 1941, she was a marvel, modernized, powerful, and manned by an experienced crew. Her optical rangefinders were the finest instruments available, her gunners trained to fire with precision under starlight. Yet none of this mattered when, in November 1942, she faced USS Washington off Guadalcanal. The American battleship tracked Kirishima through radar long before either ship was visible. Firing solutions were computed electronically. Shells were guided not by instinct but by mathematics. In 7 minutes of radar-directed fire, Washington turned a modern warship into a blazing wreck. The engagement was not a contest between equals. It was a demonstration of what happened when two technological epochs collided. Kirishima's crew fought bravely. Her officers made sound tactical choices, but they were blind against an opponent who could see perfectly. This was the essential lesson that Okumiya and Omeya tried to impart in their later writings. That courage and professionalism, while noble, could not offset systemic technological inferiority. The Americans had leaped ahead, and the gap widened relentlessly. Japanese units fought with increasing desperation, resorting to extraordinary measures as conventional tactics failed. By 1945, the Imperial Navy was reduced to kamikaze attacks, an act of tragic symbolism, where human life itself became the last weapon against machines that could not be outflown or outgunned. The devotion of those pilots was unquestionable, but their sacrifice only underscored the futility of bravery against a foe who fought from the future. When the guns finally fell silent, the reckoning was not just military, but philosophical. The Pacific War had revealed that technology could alter the very meaning of warfare. The Americans had not merely won the naval war. They had redefined it. Victory no longer belonged solely to those who fought hardest, but to those who could transform knowledge into power, and power into systematized dominance. The moment USS Washington's radar locked onto Kirishima in the darkness off Savo Island, the age of the machine had eclipsed the age of the man. The future of war had arrived, and it belonged to those who built it.